Welcome to another audit walkthrough video from SuperfastCPA. I'm Logan, and in today's video, we're going to be going over Audit Area 3. This is Section C. This is an application topic. Determine the appropriate sampling method to be used in order to accomplish the objective, and that would be things like the control, attribute, or test of detail, and those will be the methods of the planned procedures. And we're going to be doing that the SuperfastCPA way, which is diving straight into the questions to learn the material. Now, if you don't know much about our strategies, make sure you go to SuperfastCPA.com and sign up for our free 1-hour webinar training. Again, it is free. It is only 1 hour long, and we will teach you the key ingredients to passing the CPA exam in that 1 hour. So make sure you check that out. Also, just letting you know, in today's video, we're only going to be going over 6 questions. Normally we go over 5, but today we're going over 6. But if you become a SuperfastCPA Pro member, you'll get access to the full 12-question version of the video. Typically it's 10 questions, but in today's video, it's 12. And again, Pro members get access to the full versions of the videos. So if you like this and you like other videos, make sure you check out becoming a SuperfastCPA Pro member. Now with all that, let's dive straight into the questions. All right, here we are at question 1, and something that you'll see throughout this video that I'd like to point out is you want to read the last part of the question first. This is a good strategy and a good habit to be in for test day because you have no idea what each question is going to be like on the exam. So it's good to be in the habit of reading the last sentence first so that you have kind of an idea, kind of have the context for what the question is going to be about. So we're going to practice that in this video. Which of the following sampling methods would the auditor most likely use in this situation? So we're thinking about sampling methods. Let's go up to the top. An auditor is planning to test whether purchase orders were properly authorized before being processed. To do this, the auditor selects a sample of purchase orders and examines them for documented evidence of approval. So again, which of the following sampling methods would they most likely use? Let's go through the options. Option A, variable sampling. Option B, attribute sampling. Option C, discovery sampling. Option D, stratified sampling. So if you have any idea what these different sampling methods are, then you might know the answer. If you don't know though, that's okay. We're going to learn in this video a lot about the sampling methods and a lot of the things that have to go into deciding what sampling method to use. So again, if you don't know the answer, that's okay. We're going to look at it right now. All right, here we are at the answer B, attribute sampling. So this is an example of attribute sampling. We're going to learn what that is. Let's go into the explanation. Attribute sampling is used in tests of controls, and we've talked about tests of controls a little bit in previous videos, to estimate the rate of occurrence of a specific characteristic or attribute in a population. In this case, the auditor is testing whether the control requiring authorization of purchase orders is functioning properly. This is a yes/no question. Was it authorized or not? Which is a classic use of attribute sampling. So very frequently, you're going to see something similar to that when it comes to attribute sampling. Let's talk a little bit about tests of controls and what they typically focus on. And again, usually you're using attribute sampling when it comes to tests of controls. So usually tests of controls are focusing on authorization. So that'd be things like, are there approvals before processing? Completeness, that would be things like, are all the transactions recorded? Things like accuracy, are the amounts entered correctly? Not verifying the amounts, but are they entered correctly? And then validity, are the transactions legitimate? In contrast, variable sampling, and that's another thing that we're going to learn about in this video, but this is different than attribute sampling. Variable sampling is used in substantive testing. And again, we've talked about substantive testing a little bit in other videos as well. So that'd be things like testing account balances or monetary misstatements. And discovery sampling is typically used when the auditor is looking for fraud or critical exceptions. So that was another one of the options that there was. So we're not going to use discovery sampling in this situation either. And then stratified sampling is a technique used to improve efficiency, not a standalone method for a specific type of testing. So stratified sampling is essentially, by the way, just in case I'm realizing that I might not have explained stratified sampling very much in this video. Stratification is essentially where you are kind of grouping information into different pieces so that, let's say a group of like everything that's over $100,000 is going to be in this group. Everything between $50,000 and $100,000 is going to be in this group. That would be stratification so that you can test different groups and make it a little bit easier to kind of figure out if there are errors in different areas instead of testing it all at once or doing a sample of all of it at once. So that's stratified sampling. And that's something that's not its own method. That's just going to be something you could use in a whole bunch of different sampling methods. So that's why that's not the correct answer. So in this case, we learned about attribute sampling. Again, that is something you're going to use for tests of controls, and it would be used for things like authorization, completeness, accuracy, validity, things like that. Now let's go to the next question to learn a little bit more. All right, here we are at question 2. What is the auditor primarily trying to determine in this test? Let's go up to the top. An auditor is using attribute sampling to evaluate the effectiveness of a control requiring dual signatures on checks exceeding $10,000. After examining a sample of checks, the auditor calculates the deviation rate and compares it to the tolerable deviation rate. So again, what are they trying to determine in this test? We just barely talked about attribute sampling, so we're going to kind of see it in action a little bit here. Option A, whether the control deviation rate results in a material misstatement of the financial statements. Option B, whether the monetary misstatement per transaction exceeds the tolerable error. Option C, whether the actual rate of control failure is likely to exceed what the auditor is willing to accept. or option D, whether the sample is representative of the population in terms of dollar value. So again, what are they trying to do with attribute sampling in this case? If you don't know, again, we're only at the second question right now, so you might not really know, but that's okay. If you do have an idea, maybe pause the video and think about it, and when you're ready, come back, we'll look at the answer together. All right, here we are at the answer C, whether the actual rate of control failure is likely to exceed what the auditor is willing to accept. So that's what they're trying to do in this situation with attribute sampling. Let's go through it again. We're kind of building on what we know about attribute sampling right here. Attribute sampling is used to evaluate the effectiveness of internal controls by testing whether the rate of control deviations, or the failures, exceeds a level that the auditor considers acceptable, known as the tolerable deviation rate. So essentially the tolerable deviation rate, in very simple terms, is how much error the auditor is willing to accept in the sample. The goal isn't to measure dollar misstatements, but to determine if the control can be relied upon based on the observed failure rate. So they're using attribute sampling to see if the failure rate is low enough for them to be able to rely on the control. Now let's talk about the key concepts of attribute sampling, kind of going over this one more time. First off, deviation rate equals, again, the rate at which the control fails in the sample. Tolerable deviation rate is the maximum rate of failure the auditor is willing to accept and still rely on the control. So you can see the difference there between tolerable and the just normal deviation rate. If the estimated deviation rate exceeds the tolerable rate, the auditor may conclude that the control is not effective and adjust the audit strategy. This contrasts with variable sampling, and we talked a little bit about that in the first question, which deals with monetary misstatements and projecting errors to balances, not deviation rates. So we're kind of seeing the difference there between variable and attribute sampling. We learned a little bit more about it. Now let's go to the next question. All right, here we are at question 3. Which of the following best describes the difference between statistical sampling and non-statistical sampling in an audit? Let's go through the options. Option A, statistical sampling is only used in substantive testing, while non-statistical sampling is only used in tests of controls. Option B, statistical sampling uses probability theory to measure sampling risk, while non-statistical sampling relies on auditor judgment without quantifying sampling risk. Option C, statistical sampling requires a larger sample size than non-statistical sampling in all audit situations. Or option D, statistical sampling is required under GAS, while non-statistical sampling is prohibited for testing controls. So based on what we read there and, kind of understanding what statistical means and what non-statistical means, you can probably kind of think through this and at least have a good guess. So I would recommend that you pause the video and come back when you're ready, and we'll look at the answer together. All right, here we are. The answer is B. Statistical sampling uses probability theory to measure sampling risk, while non-statistical sampling relies on auditor judgment without quantifying sampling risk. So that's kind of the difference between those two. We're learning statistical and non-statistical are kind of broader categories. The things we've been talking about so far, variable and attribute sampling, they kind of fall into these categories. So let's make sure that we understand what they are. The key difference between statistical and non-statistical sampling is that statistical sampling involves the use of mathematical formulas and probability theory to quantify sampling risk and to select a random representative sample. This allows the auditor to make objectively supported conclusions about the population. In contrast, non-statistical sampling, and that'd be sometimes called judgmental sampling, does not quantify sampling risk and relies more heavily on auditor judgment for sample selection and evaluation. While it can still be appropriate under GAS, it lacks the objectivity and precision of statistical methods. So you can still use it, but it's probably not going to be as objective and precise as statistical sampling. So let's talk about examples of statistical sampling methods. Some examples would be attribute sampling. And we talked about that quite a bit already, and that's usually for tests of controls. That's a statistical sampling method. Classical variable sampling is also a statistical sampling method if it's for substantive testing. And monetary unit sampling, or MUS, is also a statistical sampling method, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Sometimes it's called a different name. But again, those are usually statistical sampling methods, not non-statistical sampling methods. Both statistical and non-statistical approaches can be used in tests of controls or substantive tests, but only statistical sampling allows for quantifying the risk that the sample doesn't represent the population. So, you can use both, but typically statistical is preferred because you can be more objective, you can be more precise, and you can quantify the risk better than if you used non-statistical sampling. Let's talk about the other options. Option A is incorrect because both methods can be used for either type of test, for substantive or test of controls, but again, usually statistical is preferred. Option C is incorrect because sample size depends on risk factors, not the method that you're using. And we're going to talk about sample size in a few questions. Option D is incorrect because both are permitted under GAS. Again, you can use statistical or non-statistical, but typically statistical is preferred, and you'll notice that attribute sampling, classical variable sampling, the things that you typically see usually are done in a statistical sampling way. All right, let's go to the next question. All right, here we are at question 4. Which type of sampling is the auditor most likely using in this situation? Let's go up to the top. An auditor selects a sample of customer accounts receivable and tests the recorded balances against supporting documentation to estimate whether the total recorded balance is materially misstated. So again, what type of sampling are they most likely doing? Let's go through the options. Option A, attribute sampling. Option B, random block sampling. Option C, discovery sampling. Or option D, variable sampling. We've learned a little bit about some of these throughout the video so far, so maybe pause the video, think through what we've learned, and come back when you're ready. All right, here we are. The answer is D, variable sampling. So we've talked about this a little bit so far, but we're going to dive a bit more into it now. Variable sampling is used in substantive testing to estimate the dollar amount of misstatement in a population. In this scenario, the auditor is testing a monetary balance, accounts receivable, to determine whether it's fairly stated. This type of sampling is designed to project misstatements found in the sample to the population and evaluate whether those misstatements could result in a material misstatement of the financial statements. Key indicators that variable sampling is appropriate. So these are some key things that you want to pay attention to know if you probably are going to use variable sampling. The focus is on monetary amounts. It's not a yes or no control effectiveness question. That would be attribute sampling most likely. And the goal is to estimate misstatements, not control deviations. So that's another clue that it's probably going to be variable sampling, not attribute sampling. And then it's also part of substantive procedures, not tests of controls. Again, you are not going to do variable sampling for tests of controls. You're going to do it for substantive testing. Tests of controls is usually attribute sampling. So that's the difference there. Attribute sampling is wrong. And I've said this so far multiple times because usually that's for yes or no questions in control testing. Was something approved? Was something not approved? Discovery sampling is for finding rare critical deviations like fraud. And we're not going to dive super deep into discovery sampling, but just letting you know that that is not the same thing as variable sampling or attribute sampling. And then random block sampling is not a standalone method for this type of audit objective and isn't the right classification here. And again, we're not going to dive really very deep into random block sampling. I just wanted to make it clear the difference here between variable sampling and attribute sampling. Variable sampling, you're focusing more on amounts and you're not really testing control effectiveness. You are doing more substantive procedures when it comes to variable sampling. All right, with that, let's go to the next question. Okay, here we are at question 5. Which sampling method is the auditor most likely using and how is it classified? Let's go up to the top. An auditor is designing a test to estimate whether the accounts receivable balance is materially misstated. The auditor wants a sampling method that automatically gives larger dollar balances a higher chance of selection while still providing a basis to project misstatements to the population. So again, what sampling method are they most likely going to use? Let's go through the options. Option A, attribute sampling, which is a non-statistical method used in tests of controls. Option B, classical variable sampling. That would be a statistical method used when all items have equal selection chance. Option C, probability proportional to size or PPS sampling, a statistical method that focuses on overstatement risk in account balances. Or option D, haphazard sampling, which is a non-statistical method that eliminates selection bias. So based on what we've learned so far, think about this, is it going to be attribute sampling? Is it classical variable sampling? We've learned a lot about those, but we haven't learned very much about PPS sampling or haphazard sampling. Pause the video, think through this. Which one of these do you think is going to be used when they are doing this type of sampling that they want to do with the larger dollar balances? Pause the video and come back when you're ready. All right, here we are at the answer. C, probability proportional to size or PPS sampling. That's what they're going to use, and that is a statistical method that focuses on overstatement risk in account balances. So we're going to dive a bit more into this. PPS sampling, and this is, by the way, also called monetary unit sampling. So you know how, I don't know if you noticed this, but in one of the questions, we had MUS sampling. That's the same thing as PPS sampling. So this is a statistical sampling method commonly used in substantive testing of account balances. It is especially useful when, first, the auditor wants to test for overstatements, and that would be things like in the assets like accounts receivable or inventory. It's also useful when larger dollar items are more likely to contain misstatements and should therefore have a higher chance of selection. And it's also useful when the auditor wants to project dollar misstatements found in the sample to the population. This method automatically gives larger dollar items a greater probability of selection without requiring separate stratification. It is not well suited for detecting understatements or omissions since it draws only from recorded amounts. So just to kind of make sure that that makes sense, probability proportional to size. Essentially, if an account has a higher dollar amount, then it's proportionally larger in comparison to other accounts when it comes to size. So therefore, it is going to have a higher chance of being selected for the sample. And that's the whole point behind PPS sampling is you are trying to make it so that you're more likely to focus on the things that have a higher dollar amount because they might have a higher chance of misstatement. And again, it's in these situations where you want to test for overstatement, where the larger dollar items are more likely to have misstatements, and they want to project those misstatements to the population. So that's why you would want to use PPS sampling and kind of the idea behind it. Option A is incorrect because attribute sampling, we learned a lot about that so far, is used in tests of controls, not dollar-based testing. Option B refers to classical variable sampling, which doesn't weigh selection by dollar size. In fact, classical variable sampling usually has the same likelihood of being picked for all pieces of the population, for all pieces of the sample. And then option D is a non-statistical method that does not allow projection of misstatements or quantification of sampling risk. So we learned a little bit more about another sampling method in that question, PPS sampling. Now let's go to the next question. All right, here we are at question 6. Which of the following changes would most likely result in a larger sample size when performing substantive testing using variable sampling? Okay, option A, increasing the standard deviation of the population. Option B, decreasing the expected misstatement. Option C, increasing the tolerable misstatement. Or option D, decreasing the population size from 10,000 to 1,000. So again, which of the following changes is most likely going to result in a larger sample size? And this is very relevant when it comes to sampling methods because you have to know how much you are going to be sampling. You have to know the sample size and what affects that. So if you don't know the answer to this, that's okay. But if you do, maybe pause the video and think through this. And when you're ready, come back. We'll look at the answer together. All right, here we are. The answer is A, increasing the standard deviation of the population. That's something that will affect the sample size. So let's go through this. Again, we're learning about what affects sample size because that's very relevant for the sampling methods. Let's go through the explanation. Sample size in variable or substantive sampling is influenced by 4 key factors. Tolerable misstatement. The higher the tolerable error, the smaller the sample size. You're willing to accept more error, so you need less precision, and vice versa. If the tolerable error is lower, then you are going to have a higher sample size. Expected misstatement, that's another thing. The higher the expected error, the larger the sample size. You need more evidence to detect and measure misstatements. Standard deviation or variability. If there's more variability in the population, the larger the sample size needed to achieve reliable results. And then finally, population size. And you may have heard this throughout college. In most cases, population size has a minor effect on sample size unless the population is very small. In fact, past a certain point, unless, again, the population is very small, population size pretty much has no effect on sample size. So I just want to make sure that that's clear because, again, you've probably heard that before, but I just want to reiterate it. Past a certain point, and I'm not going to talk about, it's a little bit objective, that certain point, but, depending on the population that you're testing. But overall, once you get past a certain point for population size, if that population size keeps increasing a whole bunch, it's not really going to affect the sample size, even if it increases a lot. Decreasing from 10,000 to 1,000 usually does not reduce sample size substantially in audit sampling. Again, past a certain point, population size really has almost no effect on sample size. So the correct answer is A. When the population is more variable, the auditor must test more items to achieve the same level of assurance. Or again, increasing the standard deviation of the population is going to be the correct answer there. So with that, we've learned a lot about sampling methods and how to determine what the correct sampling method is and the things that are going to affect the sampling size and things like that throughout these first 6 questions. Before we do anything else, let's do one more part of the SuperFast CPA process called pillar topics. Now, the idea behind pillar topics is as you're going through the questions to learn the material, you will notice the things that keep popping up in the questions. You've seen 2 or 3 or 4 questions trying to teach you what attribute sampling is and all the different things that go into that. Or whatever the case is, you notice these things in the questions that you're doing, and so you take a moment and write these out as pillar topics, kind of the most important things you learned in your own words, so that as you're doing this each day, you're building your own personal repository of the most important things you learned from the questions so that you are ready for test day. So let's go ahead and take a look at the pillar topics for this video. All right, here we are at the pillar topics. Let's just dive straight in. First off, attribute sampling is used in tests of controls. It evaluates whether a specific control like authorization or approval is operating effectively by testing for the presence or absence of a particular attribute. Now let's go to the next one. Variable sampling is used in substantive testing to estimate misstatements. It is applied when the auditor wants to determine whether account balances or transaction amounts are materially misstated. Now let's talk about monetary unit sampling, or again, that's PPS sampling. You might see either one of those. That focuses on overstatements. It is a statistical method that gives larger dollar items a higher chance of selection and is effective for testing existence and valuation of assets. Now let's talk about statistical sampling. Statistical sampling quantifies sampling risk. Non-statistical sampling relies on judgment. Statistical methods use probability theory and allow for projecting results, while non-statistical methods depend on auditor experience and cannot quantify risk. Now let's talk about sample size. Sample size is inversely related to tolerable misstatement. So just to make sure that's clear, if tolerable misstatement is higher, sample size is going to be lower. If tolerable misstatement is lower, sample size is going to be higher. As tolerable misstatement increases, the required sample size decreases. The auditor is willing to accept more error, so less testing is needed. Now let's talk about sample size. in other instances, other things that will affect it, sample size increases with expected misstatement, with population variability, and with audit risk. So it goes up. It's directly related to those. Higher risk or variability in the population requires a larger sample to achieve reliable audit conclusions. So again, we learned a lot about sample size and about the sampling methods, and the biggest ones are attribute sampling, variable sampling, and a little bit about PPS sampling. But again, attribute sampling and variable sampling, biggest ones there. And we learned about statistical and non-statistical sampling a little bit as well. So again, we went over a lot in this video in this first 6 questions and the pillar topics. Now that is the end of the YouTube version of this video. But just remember, Superfast CPA Pro members are going to get access to the full 12-question version of the video when we post it in the member forum. So if you like this and you like our other videos, make sure you check out becoming a Superfast CPA Pro member, because you'll get access to, again, the full versions so you can get a little bit more practice and a little bit more understanding. And the easiest way to become a Superfast CPA Pro member is actually by going to superfastcpa.com and signing up for our free 1-hour webinar training first, because that will teach you the key ingredients to passing the CPA exam. It will kind of give you a better path to understanding Superfast CPA, and it will give you a good path to becoming a Superfast CPA Pro member. So go check out the webinar, then check out becoming a Pro member, and you'll get access to a lot of great stuff if you become a Pro member. Now with all that, I hope this video was helpful. If you did like the video, make sure to like it and leave a comment. After you do that, thank you, and I will see you in the next video.